in the chat, that would be great. All right, thank you. So I'm Colleen Fisk, the Education Director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project, calling in from the Nina Al Nana outside Betna, which is Wasilla, Alaska. And today we have Patrick Freeland, who's presenting today. Patrick is of the Wind Clan of the Muskogee Cree Nation of Oklahoma. He's a graduate of Haskell Indian Nations University and Purdue University, with a focus on American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Indigenous peoples' adaptation to climate change and preservation of tribal and cultural sovereignty. And through commitment to action, Patrick centers his work ethic and civic engagement through intergenerational knowledge sharing and through the utilization of interdisciplinary sciences, arts, and engineering as a means to improve human and environmental health, social advancement, and intercultural understanding through reconciliation. So Patrick's research and professional development have centered on climate change adaptation and mitigation, non-cognitive development and education, and advancement of plural knowledges and consciousness or conscientiousness. There we go. So I'm really looking forward to Patrick's presentation today, looking at discussing creating open access tools, content, and collaboration to advance pre-K through 16 Indigenous climate education. So Patrick, I will let you take
Colleen,
it away.
do you mind if we just let people do announcements really quick if they have any?
Yeah, got announcements, then we'll let Patrick present. James Callahan, Jim.
Yes, and I wanted to wait to make sure anyone else wanted to step in. If people, I will put in the chat, if people aren't familiar with it, the STEM for All video showcase, which is hosted by Turk, which in turn is sponsored by the NSF. One of the things that program does is has monthly themes, which are very well attended by teachers, people in education, by programs all across the country. It's very well attended on different themes related to STEM. This coming month, their focus will be on change makers, with the idea of students actually making change relates to STEM on societal issues. It's a great topic. They've selected me to be the moderator for it. And that means I'm part of choosing the panelists and putting together the program. And some of the things that I think are exciting about it is, on the one hand, it's a way that we can highlight and bring together different programs that are doing change on climate change, Carolyn and Colleen and people here. But it also they're wonderful at bringing together different elements of STEM. Right. And they're also, it's STEM for All video showcase. This is social justice too. This is not just STEM, but they bring together so they'll be looking, they'll have suggestions. They're asking me for suggestions of people who are doing change making in other forms of STEM, not climate. And we learn from each other. They have their techniques that we should maybe be using. They look at our techniques we're doing. It's a great collaborative thing. I will announce to people when I know the date. I will probably know later today when I talk to them. We'll get it. And please be assured, Clean will be very well promoted and represented, since I get to choose a lot what gets said. So it's an honor, and it's a great thing on that. So thank you on the time. Thanks.
Thank you. That's awesome. Maybe you can put the link for STEM for All video showcase in the chat if others aren't familiar with that. Yeah, thanks. Katie.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for all your work on that, Jim. And Gina put the link for my announcement in the chat already. We're starting the Clean Professional Development webinar series this week. Tomorrow is the first, and then we'll have 4 in the series. So we'll go for 4 weeks. We'll have a special one in April around Earth Day as well. So check out the link that Gina put in there and help us spread the word about that for educators who might be interested, or join us. Thanks.
Thank you. Carolyn.
Hey, so we are going to, we're going to make a big post. We're currently working on the social media toolkit to send out to the Clean listserv, but the first cohort of the year for the Clio Speakers Network has just opened for registration. I'm working on updating it each and every time. same as usual. For those of you who haven't heard me sort of shill for my programs before, we talk about the science impacts and solutions of climate change, and we have a big focus on public speaking, advocacy, environmental justice. We bring in elected officials and folks who work in policy to really talk about effective advocacy. So if you or anyone else might be interested, as I said, I'll put together a post that goes out to the listserv later this week. If you just wouldn't mind sharing this with your networks or anyone who might be interested, either the link or the post later, I'd be very grateful. It is Florida focused because our headquarters are in Miami, but anyone and everyone is welcome to join.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more hands for announcements. So I will cede the floor to Patrick for your presentation. Thanks for being here today.
Hello, thank you. So, Inchje, Istango, Patrick, Austin, Freeland, Jeff Gidos. My name is Patrick Freeland, of Wind Clan in the Skokie Nation of Oklahoma. It's an honor to be here today, and I'd like to kind of describe an idea with you, this idea of building a fire. But before we begin, if you feel comfortable, I'd like you all to just take a moment and, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes, just take a deep breath, just really concentrate on that feeling of breathing. In your mind's eye, I want you to remember. Remember the first time that maybe you learned to build a fire. Maybe it was a relative or a family member that you watched, and you asked about how they would do it and they showed you, or maybe it was in a public place or part of a classroom. But thinking about someone or somehow that taught you to build a fire, and really for a moment just concentrating on how you felt with that knowledge. And when you feel comfortable, you can open your eyes. And so I'll ask a few folks, and again, if you feel comfortable sharing, please, but if not, you don't have to. But Katie, tell me about the first time that you learned to build a fire.
So I thought of, I couldn't quite pinpoint the exact moment, but I thought of many outings with my father. We used to camp, and we did several fishing trips when I was younger, some of which were, in more rural areas where we could have campfires. And so for me, it was my father and that connection with him in the outdoors, being able to spend time outside, thinking about being in the mountains around water, and having that fire. And I know he was the one who really taught me how to build the fire. I thought of the way that he showed me, to use the kindling and to stack the bigger logs and, trying to keep it going, and how to, blow the air, the oxygen. He told me, about the science behind adding the oxygen to the fire and things like that. So, learning about the process, but also just that personal connection for me to the outdoors and to family was what really popped up for me when you shared that prompt.
Oh, thank you. Wendy.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to remember this time. My story is very similar to Katie's. Father, camping, childhood, and an unexpected thought came to me as I relived those memories, and it was one of feeling just a little bit safer in the world, because I had a way to create heat and light and cook food that as a child I even felt that much more empowered to be a human on the planet. So that all kind of came back to me.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. Would anyone else like to share? Colleen, it's your last day. How did it feel when you were first learning to build a fire?
I think similarly, I couldn't pinpoint one specific memory. Grew up with my family, all my parents going camping and doing stuff outdoors. But it made me think about times that I've worked with my stepdaughter, who's 7, and teaching her about fire and safety around fire, and talking with her about what you need to have to build a fire. And then it also made me think about reading to build a fire, which is a short story, and thinking about the white Chichacos in Alaska who don't know how to take care of themselves in the cold winter. And yeah, so just a lot of different things that were coming up thinking about fire, not necessarily I can't even remember the first time I built my own fire. And I think it's Wendy's last day.
Oh, my apologies.
Happy to be here as well.
No announcements, Colleen.
Nope.
Well,
I'd be the last to know.
Well, thank you all for sharing. And again, I feel like that our, as humans, connection to fire is something that transcends, I think, our individual tribes and our nations and our peoples. It's something that's very deep within us. This idea of connection, right? It stems very strongly, especially connection to relatives. You are learning from, usually a family member or someone that, you had a certain trust with. Same thing with connecting to particular places, as Katie mentioned, the mountains, the water, usually it's a place that's outside. There's a process behind it. There's a science to it. There's a certain familiarity, a certain safety, right? That comes up, especially for that heat, that warmth, that connection. And especially I appreciated, Colleen, the idea of it's intergenerational, right? Sometimes when you learn to do something like this from someone else, you kind of find yourself in more ways than one teaching that. And so I think that this metaphor is really important when we're thinking about adapting to climate change. And hang on just a second, there we go. And more often than not, I think that in this world, especially when we work with, grants and projects, you're forced into a group of people, and there's very little time to really establish that relational connection. And you may be doing some, outstanding work, particularly in the fields of education or in other domains, but at the same time, it can be very tedious, it can be very painful. Like who's always dreads that there's a potential grant coming up, right? You think, oh, I just stack something else onto my plate, right? Or there's these sensations that I think that happen, especially when we're trying to build bridges, working with peoples, plural, right? Not necessarily just different persons, but people with entirely different worldviews and epistemics. And just real quick, check. Can you see the presentation? Is that what's okay? Yep. I'm just making sure. So I think that what can be really useful then in this idea is to think of building a fire in the same warmth and connection and emotion that you would feel with that relation to doing work adapting to climate change. And I think especially as we think about this bigger idea of indigenous climate education, right? You can't separate the places or the worldviews or the connections to the knowledge sharing itself. And also kind of keep in mind there's a certain plurality that comes along with that, right? Indigenous must be connected to place. And because there's so many different places, there's not a singular way to do something in an indigenous practice. But something that I think that all of us can definitely relate to is that before you can build a fire, you first have to set your fireplace. And so what I mean by that is, you have to kind of clear a space. Sometimes it can be very cluttered whenever you're, kind of working in a place, or, like let's say, for instance, you're trying to build a fire in the snow. You have to clear that snow off at least a little bit first before you can kind of set your logs down. And so in this metaphor, the first, oh shoot, hang on. There we go. So the first piece of adaptation work and developing a knowledge sharing network is you have to begin with setting agreements. Right. Now you have a group of people. It could be people you've worked with for years, someone that's brand new, but you have to take that time to not only understand who each person is within your particular organization, but to really understand what are their norms. How do they communicate? How do people know they're being listened to? How do they know that they're being respected? You know, how do you understand the meaning and nature of silence? You know, what does it mean to come to an agreement? And oftentimes this process is skipped in a lot of organizational development, but arguably this is the most crucial part. And so once you've set your agreements and your norms, you can essentially take the next step and build your first spark. And it's with this spark that just like building a fire, you start little to big, right? You don't just go throw a log right on the fire. And then you have to really focus. You have to center on what is the focus of this particular work, once you've developed those agreements and norms. And so as you've kind of defined that focus, you also kind of start to begin to articulate your vision. This is a metaphor again, right? It's your first brightness, first light that you can see. And with this vision, you can begin to center a bit on common values. And especially when you're working with peoples, plural, from different groups, those common values allow you to center your work and the focus of your work. So that way you don't necessarily have to get lost on the individual differences. And as your fire begins to build and grow stronger, you have to feed it. And so the next challenge is the organizational development that really has to come in, right? And this is where I think that most people try to start. People try to start with putting together a team or setting an organization and defining an anchor. But if you follow this building a fire process, then when you bring your anchoring organization on, you've already set your agreements and communication regularity. You've got norms for your behavior. You've got your focus. You understand how to center your agreements and your values. And then the organizational development just simply carries out what this direction has been set by this previous work. And the anchoring organization literally will provide fuel for this fire. But it takes a minute for this to happen, right? And so I think the next step is that you start to foster your partnerships. You really focus on forging these broader relationships. And in this building a fire type of way, the goal is not to build one singular fire, right? Think about if we tried to do that for every nation in just this continent alone, there's only one fire, it would be monstrous. It'd be huge, it'd be unsustainable. So instead, the goal is to build fires that teach other people how to build their own. And sometimes an organization could really struggle taking off, so you can offer and share a little bit of your own. And so ultimately, this fire building really centers around connection, in that interpersonal way. It really centers on navigating through feeling, emotion, aesthetic, things that oftentimes are discounted in, typical project management plans. But ultimately, this idea of relationality, something that's very hard to evaluate, but very easy to understand, is the guiding principle for this work, being a good relative. So when we think about this idea of creating a metaphor, and from this process, and I'm going to share a little bit with you, a little bit more specifics of how we use this to essentially define a knowledge sharing network, one that was intertribal and interinstitutional. So at the very beginning, when a small council of indigenous scientists, and educators kind of came together, from different places all over the place, and they decided, well, we want to center on, on some core values. And so the first core values were central. There's 3 points. There was sovereignty. And of course, the council took the time to really explore what does that idea mean in context of this work, right? Because there's, tribal sovereignty, there's cultural sovereignty, there's individual sovereignty, But then this collective sovereignty, and what does that mean? To support and promote that. And also the value centering of responsibility, right? Understanding that, each of us as individual agents has a certain power, but collectively we have not just power in plural, we have this responsibility to act. We have knowledges and that we can't choose to ignore. But at the same time, we have to understand our limitations, right? So what is it that we are responsible in actuating? And then, of course, relationality. This idea that we have to do so in a familial way. Projects come and go, funding comes and goes. Institutions can last, and sometimes they fall apart. But if you truly build a relationship with someone, that could last literally a lifetime. And so when you center these three values, the next step is to bring partners together, but to recognize that, just like this, simple drawing here, some partners are in different locations. Some are connected to each other while others may be far apart. Some are bigger than others. Some are smaller than others. But it's also important to recognize that if we're doing something in a scope that's to be inclusive, you have to recognize maybe that there's partners missing. So being very aware of what comprises this, this partnership, and literally having, representatives of different peoples. And within, so centering around these values of these partners is also understanding you have to have eco-regional representation. It's one thing to recognize each other as human beings, as relatives, but recognizing the landscapes, and seascapes and, mountains and rivers and other places as being part of us, right? That have have a voice. Because again, this is indigenous climate education, right? So we have to recognize and honor those knowledges that have been instilled from us, from our many peoples. But by also including these different eco-regional representations, we're also able to understand the differentiation, right? We wouldn't have necessarily dealing with the same challenges on a coastline as we would in perhaps a tallgrass prairie, and just as we, wouldn't have the same kind of needs in an Arctic space as we would in, say, like Sonoran Desert. But by recognizing that, there are these key differences, it helps us to understand that we have boundaries that we can address, and that, what works in one place might work in those different similar ecoregions, but don't necessarily have to work and be homogeneous. So as we kind of find out this makeup of who we are, right, and we start to, kind of develop this organization, there has to be direction. But more than just having a direction of where you're going, you also have to know where it is that you're coming from. Right. And so that's why a strong evaluative process is very crucial to this. And no direction is healthy without a solid sense of vision. And so vision is really, is really crucial. And there's this old saying, I don't know who said this first, but I've adopted it definitely. They say that, vision without action is only a dream, but action without vision is a nightmare. And then with this vision that you find, power comes in balance, right? That, if you have lopsided power structures, even though you may have a lot of strength, you might find yourself spinning in circles. And that your guidance, doesn't necessarily come directly from your power, but it has to come from wisdom, from these things of the elder knowledges, from the love and care and compassion and evidence we find in our day-to-day interactions. And so this becomes our metaphor for change. For those of you who often find yourselves working in nonprofit spaces, working with different theories of change, our council spent some time, using the building a fire process to develop this. And this is our theory of change. But this isn't just ours. This was something that was created that could be useful, useful for others. So if this is something that you can see using in your work, go for it. One of the things that we did to vet this is we, and I tend to do this with a lot of the work I do, is if you can explain this to a child and an elder and both understand, then you've probably got your solid idea. So we actually worked with some little kids to kind of actually draw this in the sand. They understood it. And I'll share more information where to access this later, but again, this is part of like an actual downloadable printable poster. So if you want to print this, beautiful, 2 by 3 foot poster that describes every single one of these processes, you're very welcome. And it's part of this, building a fire.org suite. And so that's just, like one of the first pieces, this idea of change. And so again, just to show you, I'm not going to read every single piece of this because you can find this on the poster, but there is a method to this, right? Because we came together, really with this idea of like, okay, we want to do some kind of climate education tool. We want to center indigenous knowledge systems. And, definitely had to kind of really understand that when we're talking about indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ecological knowledges, these aren't necessarily just a singular point of environmental data, right? The one thing I always like to tell folks is if you could, like, let's say you're putting a proposal together, if you can replace the word traditional ecological knowledge with local sensing, it's not traditional ecological knowledge, right? Traditional ecological knowledge arguably is part of a worldview. It's part of a way of life, right? And so I think that, within that is, no singular person's worldview is either uniquely their own, nor is it static. It means it's ever changing. Like it's responsive. It reflects the places that they're part of. And so understanding that context, I think, is another reason why this method can be very helpful for kind of developing, quite frankly, you must develop intertribal action. And again, but when I use that word tribe, it's closer to the psychological aspect of tribalism, right? Because arguably all peoples are indigenous to this planet, and no person comes from only one people. We all come from many peoples, plural, and it's important to recognize that aspects of ourselves. But this can be, again, a very usable way to essentially develop practicable action. And it's again, it can be modified and however you like. All of this is in Creative Commons, but our work, and again, I'm not going to read every single one of these, is to address the wicked problem of indigenous climate education. So we identified 13 pretty significant challenges. And I'm not going to read all of these. But, one challenge, of course, that indigenous climate education is generally not taught in pre-K through 12, educational settings. Arguably, even in some of like, I work in tribal college environments, very few tribal colleges address climate change directly. And even fewer address it from an indigenous perspective, meaning that they would have, elders come in and talk about their, traditional knowledge and stories and engagement with, the climate and how to, kind of do so in a ceremonial way. And so understanding that challenge is present, I think is empowering in a way, because then you literally take this list, and if you're working on any aspect that can address maybe one or possibly all, but mostly one or two, there's some language here that can be really powerful. And this is also really powerful, I think, for especially indigenous organizations that don't really necessarily have the time to always sit down and put language together, right? They're putting a proposal and they might have an idea of what they want, but here you can, literally think of it as a menu. Like, well, I know I'm doing this project. Well, what can it address? And again, this isn't exhaustive. There's also, there's probably much more. And so along the way, we started realizing that, there was other pieces missing. So for instance, if I'm an indigenous organization that may not have, really decent internet, let alone, journal subscriptions, but I want to be able to cite, really specific information, well, we put together a literature list. And so if you got a phone, go ahead and pull out your phone, because I want to show you just how easy this is to access. And so if you just go to Building a Fire, just open a web browser and go to buildingafire.org/lit. And maybe make a little sparkle or something in your window when you're able to pull that up. Yeah. You got one, cool. Yeah, you see how it just popped up, just really quick. Now, if you're there, you should see a gray button. It says download Indigenous Climate Education Bibliography.pdf. Just go ahead and click that. It should pop up in a new window. And then you'll see, just a real simple 100-page little bibliography, getting right on your phone. We built it in LaTeX, or latex, if you ever use that language. So there's actually also a BibTeX file for this. So if you want a copy of it, just let me know. I can send that to you. So if you're, again, so if you are going to go above and beyond with more than just kind of a quick citation, you can actually use this and integrate it into your work. But this, this came from a recommendation from, quite a few different folks. So not just this, this council, which was there's a majority of it, but the Rising Voices Network, we put it out there for people if they wanted to add to it, and a handful of other folks here and there. And we just asked a couple questions like, what is something that you think would be good literature for Indigenous climate education? And it's a very broad topic, right? So there's climate change perception, and so if you go in there, you'll see each of the entries has keywords. It's got little meta tags that we kind of started to put with it. And this was actually before we knew about Clean's meta tags. So in the future, we're actually going to adopt some of Clean's standards for the usability. For instance, like is this for K through 3? Is this maybe more for graduate level and a different sort of work? But part of this curation was also making sure that what we went through here that doesn't contain culturally sensitive or extractive data, right? Because sometimes there's stuff that's published that could be harmful. It may not seem that way, or at least at the if you just do like say LexisNexis search or Web of Science or something like that, literature's literature. But when we talk to the people that recommend this work, we get a chance of understanding, well, what's going to be the is this actually good work? And so that's another advantage this list has, is it incorporates that relationality component. It definitely incorporates a sovereignty component, because when we go through, we actually, because a lot of times you'll see, a title of something that says American Indian perceptions of, whatever, but then you break it down to, it's like, oh, this was maybe like just a Anishinaabe group or something like that. It's really specific. So we actually identify what was the specific tribes that were involved. If it is more pan-Indian, we also label it as such. But this again, like you'd think something like this existed. So our group essentially developed this tool because it didn't exist. And then as we created it, we adopted a principle of like, okay, well, if there's something that we are using that helps our work, maybe this could help other people's work. So we essentially publish this in Creative Commons, right? In Creative Commons attribution, right? So if you can use it any way that you want, you can modify it. As long as you cite the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network and don't sell it. And so along with this particular tool, we were talking about this idea of eco-regional representation. And if you go back to your phone, and you can just go to buildingafire.org/map. And same deal, we had this idea of, okay, we understand where tribes are in terms of like their reservation lands, right? And so, we look at this map here. On the screen, you can see the yellow, and like you can also see it's like a lime green. Well, these are federal and state recognized tribes, but we know Native peoples aren't just relegated only to these places, right? And so we also want to think, well, where were the greatest climate risks? And we had some climate models that we could use, but we started finding, because it's such a complex challenge, that actually like we used the FEMA's National Risk Index. So it included especially things like like drought, or potential like coastal erosion, or avalanche, or other things that are climate adjacent, but also included especially economic risks. And so we overlaid and that's where you can see the red, from essentially moderate to relatively high. If we did like, all scales, the whole map would be colored. So we just wanted more of the higher ones. And, which is great, but then we started realizing, okay, well, what about where the tribal peoples are highly concentrated? So if you see the little kind of white bubbles, those are where you have essentially in each county, the bigger the bubble, the higher percentage of native peoples to non-native peoples. And we also include Native Hawaiians. So here and there you'll see little blue bubbles. That includes like Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders within the continental U.S. and also in Hawaii, of course. And then overlaid with all of that is the ecoregions. You can see that kind of in the background. Now, this static map is great, but if you're on your phone now, I want you to do something. Go and click on should see it looks like the black one. It says click to launch into ArcGIS dashboard. And so what this will yield is an interactive version of this. And so again, thinking about who our users are, which is, realistically everybody, but say like tribal people. So if right now I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So if I scroll in and I just click, Tulsa, it's going to show me exactly what those national risk index indicators are, right? And you can do so for your home place, if you're in the continental U.S. So I can see from mine, I can see my population, 603,000 in Tulsa County. And all of this U.S. Census 2020 data, relatively high in national risk index rating wise, because we have, high expected annual loss, right? It's like basically 25% give or take poverty rate here, right? For instance, well, this gives me, again, really solid statistics. So again, if I'm trying to put a proposal together or address a challenge, then instead of saying like, oh, I know, Tulsa's at risk, I can cite, using some of the best data exactly and public data, why it's at risk. I can also use that same tool to see, well, what tribes are here, right? And so it shows me like this Osage Nation, there's, Muskogee Nation for the most part, there's Cherokee Nation. It also breaks down the population of the county by, race and ethnicity for all peoples, right? So I can see, for instance, Hispanic or Latino, 14.9%, white alone, not Hispanic Latino, 55.6%, two or more, 9.9%, right? And so again, that uses very public data, Census 2020, FEMA, EPA data. So it's non-extractive, or at least as less extractive as can be. But we also know it's not complete, right? So there's always some caveat. And so really, again, this whole map is really the best that we could do. Using this public data to understand visually, where people are, both in their land base and in just, population in relation to the major risks, right? So if I looked at this and said, okay, we want to definitely represent people for climate change adaptation. So Oklahoma, no brainer, right? See a lot of people there, pretty high risk. Large population, Four Corners region, same deal, Hawaii, same deal. But I don't think a lot of people think of, say, like Southern Virginia as being a place to really focus on, right? Or maybe places like, Pacific Northwest, for instance, I know gets a lot of attention, because, arguably the whole of the West Coast is under threat, but doesn't necessarily have the highest percentage of a native population per county. Does that mean to discount it? No. But this does allow us to kind of like really think that, okay, well, maybe we really need to concentrate like on, northern Montana, definitely throughout the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, but, also kind of, New York. Also, again, parts of the Carolinas that are, that are maybe, off center, maybe, especially like the southern parts of Louisiana, and Florida. So I think that this is just, again, a visual approximation to really quickly, kind of identify this. And then if you want to really dig deep and drill down into this, the data is publicly accessible. And so, again, all of this, including citations and so much more, is available on the buildingaFire.org website. And so I'm going to stop this presentation real quick. I'm just going to walk us through the website just a little bit, and then we'll open it up for some questions and discussion. I'd love to hear some feedback from you all. All right. So again, I designed this site to be very mobile friendly, but it looks good on a regular browser too. And so again, the literature page, you can download here. If you've got contributions, we're kind of hoping to do a second edition of this, and we're taking a couple steps back on how to reframe it. So originally we thought, oh, we'll take submissions till the end of December, and then we'll try to get something out by April. I'm definitely pushing that back. It's indefinite at the moment, but definitely the second edition is going to be a lot more focused, and we're really building the network, especially with like some of the Rising Voices work and others. And sorry, that little zoom thing's in the way. I can't see. No, that's not it. Yeah, so the map. You can also download a printable map. So if you're in a place that doesn't have great internet, and it's 3x4, so very high resolution. So it's a pretty big file, and again, all in Creative Commons. So you're welcome to download this and use it. We don't have the assets available easily just yet, but eventually they will be. So even like things like the Building a Fire graphics and the shape files and everything that we put together, if you use ArcGIS. Also, maybe even look into using OpenStreetMaps, because I think that there's also ways to do this. Using more kind of like open source tools. And yeah, same deal if you want to launch this from this ArcGIS dashboard, you can. And so it's just, again, it's just really, really useful. And I use this in a pinch, especially if I'm traveling somewhere. Like, so if let's say for instance, the other day I was up in Jamestown, and because we were just asking, it's like, oh, what's this? What's the tribal reservation we were on, and what was the what was the boundaries? And you can see, like, as I zoom in, a lot of these are really, 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 really tiny, right? And so, which is, it's its own kind of story because of that. But at the same time, like, this just really lets me. There we go. So this is where we were. We're in just this little kind of Jamestown Slalom area. And, so some of these, again, like, are just very, very small reservations, but I can still find out, everything I need to know about it. Federally recognized. Sometimes the again, doesn't really register, but I can also just find out everything, at least in terms of like what the EPA ecoregion is, and then the risk index by county, because sometimes these counties are pretty sparse, but it just lets me get really useful information really quickly. And lastly, just again, that theory of change, which kind of describes the building a fire process. Future work is going to be really elucidating this even further. There's a couple other projects that I've been kind of working on now, just to kind of try out this process to see how it works. It seems to work really well. There's definitely a lot of metaphors with building a fire. Like, you have to kind of, it's like, a lot of times I say it's like building a fire in the rain. Sometimes, or building a fire when there's not wood around, because like resourcing is, quite frankly, a huge issue, right? I'm sure you've all been in that space. But there's a lot of interesting information. But this knowledge sharing network metaphor, again, that describes the pieces of this this turtle and the representation, and kind of like in a nutshell, as well as some really good literature from where that came from, because a lot of this work was adapted from Eve Tuck's like Indigenous Theory of Change model, some work from Kyle White and Paulette Blanchard, and a few others. And I'm going to stop there. And Katie, you got a question?
I don't have so much of a question. I just wanted to follow on, Patrick, on this, like, as we've discussed this before. This is such an amazing project. I love it. And I just wanted to follow up with, and you and I have connected in the fall, and kind of how this is, we're trying to weave these together with the educational side of Clean. So the map we have going through the review process right now, we're hoping to get that into the Clean collection. I have personally used the literature, so there's a lot of ways I think that this can be woven into a lot of work that's done within this group. But I just wanted to mention that the resource itself, the map that you've provided, is really cool. It's a neat tool, and that is something that we will actually bring into the Clean collection. And then Patrick and I have discussed and have ideas on how we could maybe continue working together. And as he mentioned, like using some of Clean's database setup to help with the building a fire and kind of how he's been taking resources and other things like that. But then also he and I have talked about like maybe ideas around trying to build out clean resource collection too, and more indigenous science based resources into that and stuff like that. So we have thoughts and ideas. We've just connected in the last few months here, starting to build that out. But I just wanted people to know that that is something that we're talking about and interested in, and that at least the map resource we are definitely bringing into Clean at the moment. So
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I think, and again, like throughout this process, I'm sure you've all had similar stories. You would go along, you think, oh, surely this thing exists, right? And then you go looking for that thing and it doesn't, right? And then you almost have to take another step back and then build that thing before you can kind of move forward. And so I think that that's where this process that we've kind of gone through, and especially like the idea of like, we're getting to the point of we're building partnerships, especially with this idea of putting standards together, right? Because even something like, defining how to tag something is a whole process in itself, right? And it's like, oh, well, what audience would this be for, right? And so I know Clean has put together like a pretty, again, it may not seem like a lot, but your meta tagging system is a great standard. And I think that as we're kind of advancing some of our, especially the next iteration of the literature review, we'll use those standards, and explicitly, right? And, we'll do it the right way with, agreement and all that good stuff. But same deal with, so before, for instance, we're using EPA ecoregions, which are good. Again, level 1 is like 12, and level 2 is, I want to say, 25. But I've actually been doing some work lately with folks from NEON, National Ecological Observatory Network, and they have 20 NEON domains. So I think a future iteration of this is actually going to use the domains because they're a little bit more, because the boundaries are a little bit more simplified, right? And we won't discount the ecoregions completely, but what that does is it allows, we've already started to use this in another project where we're, saying like, okay, we're interested in looking at these climate adaptations for this particular region. And, Alaska is a good example, right? So if you do the whole of Alaska, it's very broad, but there's like 3 different, ecoregional domains within it. So you can really differentiate, well, am I talking about more of the Arctic, North Slope, or am I talking, more kind of like, southern coast? Or am I talking more of the kind of the same Pacific Northwest that, you'd see like almost similar in like Washington and BC? And it allows you to really kind of focus on the land and the general characteristics of the land itself and how it interacts with, like local climates, and the animals that are in the plants and animals that are attached to that particular landscape, which arguably that informs how humans live and interact as well. And so I think that, and another big reason that I'm really pushing this kind of like open access, kind of open source model is because like I'm just some guy, right? There could be someone out there that could do this way better than I even dreamed of, right? And that's where I'm, one of my big principles, like, here, if this works for you and you can do it better, please, but in the meantime, if it doesn't exist, and I need it, I need to make it. Colleen.
So I wanted to point out Deb's question in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw that. She said, will you be including success stories of change as well?
Yes, actually. So there's still a problem, under resourced, but there are some goals. Eventually the website will have it'll have a /resources, which would also echo other folks. And Katie and I were talking about maybe this being an affiliate of Clean, so some of Clean's tools being echoed on this site as well. But a /stories page, right? Because I think storytelling is huge. Because again, you can have even some of the most brilliant tools, but if you're not relating to who's making it, or sometimes that's a big question too, is like, well, who made this, right? And you want to know what their intention is. So sometimes you can, get that story and that background. And another idea is too, like I think there was this idea, of at least when we first started some of this project, because it was kind of just as a result of like like a one-shot grant, but there could be funding opportunities that could support smaller organizations, especially indigenous organizations that may not have the critical capacity or infrastructure they need to like just even carry out like a small grant. But really, like almost kind of you go into this tool and just essentially like say, oh, I need this and this, and you can kind of download a package that would help you get connected to resources or find out what you might be missing, things like that.
That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have a question too. Is this ArcGIS map? Do you have a plan for how often that will be updated?
It's well, kind of static for the time being. We did contract a woman named Julie Torres to kind of put it together for us. We kind of probably need to find another grant or project to be able to develop a newer one that kind of uses some of the more advanced techniques. So I would say I'd like to see a new one, essentially, probably not, maybe not this year, but maybe by the end of this year, but soonish, at least till the next census comes out, right? So we got a little time.
Definitely.
Mm.
I guess I'm wondering, are there ways, we're kind of got a few minutes left here, but is there ways that the Clean Network can help you? There's not a ton of us on here right now, but a lot of people can watch these recordings. And so I'm wondering how can we help you?
I don't know. I'm open to ideas always, and I think that, definitely like, stay in contact. You can, I'll put my email in the chat, just patrickfreeland@likenedknowledge.org. I'd say if there's like little pieces of these, so like let's say in the mapping project, for instance, there's a lot of opportunity for, I've talked in other circles about, for folks to kind of take a little bit more ownership of their own mapping and their own data. And there's a lot of these bigger data sovereignty conversations. So like really thinking, what might a large scale project like this look like that really involved different peoples and rights holders from different spaces that were kind of, they were, adapting it to their, to show not necessarily just the borderlands, but the actual usual and custom lands that were part of their traditional territories, and then the same thing, being able to share their own kind of like information, as they would want to, right? Like there's this idea of, you may have heard of it, like a data cube. Is where you take like all the mapping information and geospatial information, is compressed in like a container, and the tribe would essentially like own that data and how it's used. But again, much larger project. But Eric.
Yeah, thanks so much, Patrick. This is really great tools, and I really appreciate the like that high resolution map is awesome. I just would propose maybe one way to collaborate, just based on Deb's question. I think the storytelling piece and uplifting very hyper localized stories from folks, and like you said, so it's not extractive, it's really sort of self-presented, self-created, and sort of goes into a larger pool of what we're all doing. Because I'm doing a lot of work in Oakland, California, and we're encouraging high school students to really start to sort of unpack their own stories as it relates to climate education and climate change and concerns. And then sort of tied with that are kind of an action-oriented approach, where it's really about, unpacking their concerns, but with an arc towards doing things about it, as opposed to feeling anxious, because we know so many of our teens in particular, or populations that are most vulnerable, have that concern and don't have the tools or the resources to navigate the changes ahead. So kind of allowing that space, and in a self kind of contributory way, you know what I mean? So that again, to your point, it's not extractive, but it's just, we're all in this together. We're all working. These are my stories. This is where my peoples are coming from. This is the kind of knowledge that can really help to solve this together. So again, yeah, thanks for the tools. Got me thinking about lots of things.
Ooh, Deb.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for presenting this, and thank you to everybody for letting me tag on every week. I was going to ask Wendy this question in the chat, but maybe it's more efficient to just ask you directly as a way to introduce your work. Science of Sustainability in New York, they're aware of Indigenous land ownership. A quick way to introduce your group, and you've already put it in your website, but what I was going to use was climate education from an Indigenous perspective, emphasizing restoration and regeneration. Is that accurate, or shall I can email you after as a way to make sure I introduce it accurately?
So you talking to me or?
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, no, it's kind of broad, right? I think a lot of this was really, we had originally about 7 different groups that we're working with where we said, hey, like, how can we support you? What are you doing? And they all kind of are doing their own thing. So I'd say it's definitely more self-determination focused, but it's not necessarily limited, with the exception that it's focused on, climate adaptation and then sharing Indigenous knowledge.
That's good.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I have to run. It seems like if other folks want to continue chatting, I think that's great. I really appreciate this. I know I'll be sharing this with a lot of the folks that I work with up here in Alaska. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I'll see you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Colleen.
All right, take care, folks.
Thank you.